In the spring of 1931, a door on the fifth floor of a New York hotel was forced open after 24 years shut. Inside, in two dark rooms that stank of dust and old cigars, was a tiny deaf woman of 93, living on crackers and evaporated milk. And pinned inside her ragged clothes, in an oilcloth pocket held against her skin, was $500,000 in banknotes. She told them her name was Ida Mayfield, daughter of a Louisiana sugar planter, a belle of the Old South. Every word of it was a lie she had guarded for 75 years. The question the lawyers would chase across 2 continents, past 1,100 strangers all swearing they were her blood, was the simplest one of all. Who was she really? If you love the true stories the ballroom histories leave out, the private ruin hidden behind the public glamour, then subscribe and stay with me. What happened inside that sealed room only grows stranger the closer you look, and the woman at the center of it may be the most successful liar of her age. Chapter 1. The girl who burned her own name. Before she was Ida Mayfield of New Orleans, she was Ellen Walsh, and the distance between those 2 women was a lie worth $1 million. The truth, when it was finally dragged into the light long after she was dead, was almost unbearably ordinary. She was born around the 14th of January, 1838, into an Irish immigrant family, scraping a living on the wrong side of the ledger. Her father was Thomas Walsh, a peddler, a man who carried his shop on his back and walked the roads of Massachusetts, selling small goods door to door for coins. Her mother had come out of the Dublin slums with almost no schooling and a great many children. The records that survive suggest as many as 11 of them, packed into the kind of poverty that leaves a mark on a person for the rest of their life. There was no plantation, there was no sugar, there was no old family and no fine house. There was a peddler's cart, a crowded room, and a girl watching all of it with a cold and clever eye. She was not born beautiful into money. She was born hungry beside it, close enough to see the carriages of the rich roll past and far enough to understand she would never be invited into one. That is the wound at the bottom of this entire story, and everything she did for the next 90 years grew out of it. Poverty for Ellen Walsh was not a hardship to be endured. It was an enemy to be escaped, and then, once escaped, to be walled out forever. Most children of the Gilded Age poor accepted the place they were handed. The era was ruthless about station. A peddler's daughter married a labourer, kept a poor house, buried some of her own children, and died within a mile of where she was born. Ellen looked at that future and refused it with a completeness that is genuinely rare. She decided, while still a girl, that she would simply not be Ellen Walsh anymore. The first thing to go was the name. Walsh was Irish, and Irish in the America of the 1850s was a closed door. It meant Catholic, it meant servant, it meant the bottom. So she reached for something with no smell of the cart on it, a name she seems to have chosen for no better reason than that she liked the sound of it. Mayfield. It was soft. It was English. It had money in it. Ellen Walsh became Ida Mayfield, and around the new name she built a new past to match, brick by careful brick. Her father was no longer a peddler. He was Henry Mayfield, a wealthy sugar planter of Louisiana. Her mother was no longer a Dublin slum girl. She was a Crawford, a descendant, Ida would murmur, of the Earls of Crawford, a woman of education who spoke German and Spanish and Italian. She, Ida, had grown up in the warm and gracious city of New Orleans. Not one word of it was true, and that was the point. She had grasped, younger than most people ever do, a thing about her society that the rich preferred not to say aloud. In Gilded Age America, breeding was not a fact, it was a performance. If it was performed well enough and the nerve held, No one checked the deeds. A convincing story about a planter father would carry a woman further than an honest fortune, because the fortune could be counted and the story could not. To feel the size of what she was attempting, it helps to know what being Irish meant in the America she was born into. The 1840s and 50s brought the great famine ships across the Atlantic, and with them a wave of Irish poor so large and so despised that whole cities recoiled from it. Shop windows and factory gates carried signs that told them plainly they need not apply. They took the work no one else would, the digging and the hauling and the scrubbing, and then they were blamed for their own poverty by the very people who made certain they could climb no higher. A girl named Walsh, Catholic and penniless, was not looking merely at a hard start in life. She was looking at a ceiling, low and fixed, that her society had built directly over her head and did not intend to raise. Ida's answer to that ceiling was not to push against it. It was to walk out from under it, wearing another woman's face. She grasped, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone, that the true barrier was not her poverty, which could be hidden, but her name and her history, which announced her origins the instant she opened her mouth. Change the story. And the ceiling simply did not apply, because no one lowers it over a planter's daughter from New Orleans. It was, in its cold way, a kind of genius, the insight of a mind that had studied the machinery of class from underneath and worked out precisely which lever moved it, and then reached up and pulled that lever without a tremor. So she rehearsed the story until it was seamless, until she believed the softer parts of it herself, and she pointed herself at the one city where a beautiful, unknown girl with a good line could rise. In 1857, 19 years old and carrying nothing but an invented self, Ellen Walsh, calling herself Ida Mayfield, stepped into New York. She would never once, in the 75 years of life that remained to her, admit who she truly was. Behind her, she left the peddler's cart and the crowded room and the girl who had lived in them. Or she thought she did. In truth, she carried that girl with her every day, sealed away, and she never stopped being afraid of her. Chapter 2. A letter written to a married man. On the 28th of May, 1857, Ida sat down and wrote a proposition to a man she had never met. She had chosen him with the care of a hunter choosing a shot. His name was Benjamin Wood, and on paper he was almost too good a target to be real. He was rich, or lived as though he were. He was well connected in the deepest way New York understood, because his older brother was Fernando Wood, the sitting mayor of the city and one of the most powerful Democrats in the country. Benjamin was a gambler, a spender, a man of appetites, and, most usefully of all, he was the kind of man who liked new faces. There was only one obstacle, and to a woman like Ida, it barely counted as one. Benjamin Wood was married. What she wrote to him has survived, and it is worth hearing in full, because there is no better window into the mind of the girl who would one day die guarding $500,000 in a sealed room. She wrote, "Mr. Wood, Sir, having heard of you often, I venture to address you from hearing a young lady, one of your former loves, speak of you. She says you are fond of new faces. I fancy that as I am new in the city and new in affairs of the heart, I might contract an agreeable intimacy with you, of as long duration as you saw fit to have it. I believe that I am not extremely bad-looking, nor disagreeable. Perhaps not quite as handsome as the lady with you at present, but I know a little more, and there is an old saying that knowledge is power. If you would wish an interview, address a letter stating what time we may meet. Read it once for the boldness of it. A 19-year-old girl with no money and no name, coldly offering herself to a married man as a business arrangement of flexible length. Then read it again for the thing underneath. The line she could not resist slipping in, the little blade at the center of all that soft flattery. I know a little more. Knowledge is power. She was telling him, before they had ever met, that her value was not her face. Other women were prettier. Her value was her mind, and she wanted him to know it and to want it. It is the whole of her in 5 sentences. The performance of sweetness wrapped around a core of pure, unblinking calculation. He answered. Of course he answered. A man fond of new faces, presented with a face this clever, was never going to do anything else. She became his mistress that year, and she moved into the strange half-world that Gilded Age New York kept for such women, kept and pretended not to see. It was a precarious place to stand. A mistress had no rights, no name, no security. She lived entirely on a man's mood, and when the mood passed, she was put out with nothing. For most women, that arrangement was a slow trap. For Ida, it was a doorway, and she walked through it already planning how to bolt it shut behind her. Set the scene of what she was actually doing, because the nerve of it is easy to underestimate from a comfortable distance. She was 19, alone and unknown in the largest city in America, a place that swallowed girls like her without a ripple. She had no family standing behind her, no money to fall back on, no reputation to trade upon, and no second chance if the gamble failed. The respectable path for a girl in her position was domestic service, long hours and low wages, and a lifetime of being invisible. And the unrespectable path, the one that swallowed the desperate, ended in the tenements and on the streets. Between those 2 futures, Ida chose a third that almost no one had the stomach even to attempt. She would select a rich and powerful married man, entirely on the strength of study and calculation, and she would offer herself to him in writing as a proposal, the terms stated plainly, and she would stake everything on her own cleverness to carry it. And she chose well, which was itself a kind of skill. Benjamin Wood was not merely wealthy, he was joined to power at its very source. His brother Fernando had already been mayor of New York more than once, and would sit in Congress, a man who commanded one of the great political machines of the age and bent the city to it. To attach herself to Benjamin was to attach herself, at one remove, to the beating heart of democratic New York. She had not thrown her line into the water and hoped for a bite. She had studied the whole pond, chosen the largest fish in it, and baited the hook with the one thing she knew a jaded man of appetite could not ignore: a fresh face that promised it was also a clever one, because she understood Benjamin Wood in a way his wife never had. She saw that his weakness, the reckless pull toward the card table and the fresh thrill, was not something to be reformed. It was something to be managed. A careless man who cannot keep money needs someone to keep it for him, and Ida had been keeping a careful account of every coin since she was a child in her father's poorhouse. She made herself, quietly and quickly, the one steady thing in his unsteady life. She was the new face who did not fade, the clever girl who was always there, and by the time anyone thought to worry about what she was becoming, she had already become it. Chapter 3. The Mistress Who Made Herself a Wife. A mistress in Gilded Age New York was a thing to be hidden, but Ida Mayfield had no intention of staying hidden. This is the stretch of her life where the record thins and her own storytelling thickens, and it is worth being honest about that as her story is told, because she was. In later years, Ida would describe a young womanhood of dazzling society, triumph. She had been, she said, a celebrated belle in the South and a prominent socialite in the North. She let it be understood that during the visit of the Prince of Wales to America in 1860, the young man who would one day be King Edward VII, she had danced with him. She spoke of meeting Abraham Lincoln around the time of his election. How much of this was real, and how much was the same gift for invention that produced her planter father, no one can now fully untangle. She was the wife of a congressman's brother, moving in democratic New York at its height, so some of it is plausible. And she was a woman who had already rebuilt her entire origin from nothing, so some of it is almost certainly polished, far past the truth. The safest thing to say is that she reached the outer rooms of the great world, and then, in memory, she gilded those rooms until they shone. What is not in doubt is her climb from mistress to wife, and how patiently she engineered it. Benjamin's first marriage stood in her way, and she did not force it. She waited. She made herself indispensable, the manager of his money and the fixed point of his days, until the arrangement everyone could see was a marriage in all but law. And when his wife died, the way was clear, and Ida did not let a decent interval slow her down. In 1867, she married Benjamin Wood. She was about 29 years old. Consider what that meant. The peddler's daughter from the crowded room, Ellen Walsh of the Irish poor, was now Mrs. Benjamin Wood, sister-in-law to a former mayor of New York, wife to a member of the United States Congress, and the owner of a New York newspaper. She had a name that opened doors, a husband with a fortune, and a past so thoroughly buried that the people who bowed to her at dinner would have been astonished to learn there had ever been a cart. The fortune-teller she liked to quote had promised her, when she was a girl, that she would be a very lucky girl, that she would marry a rich man and get everything she wanted out of this life. Standing in 1867, a new bride in a fine gown, she had every reason to believe the promise had come true, all of it exactly as spoken. To understand how remarkable her climb truly was, picture the world she was climbing into. Gilded Age New York was the most status-obsessed society America had ever produced, a place where a rigid and unwritten code decided who was received and who was not, and where the keepers of that code guarded the gates with a ferocity that could destroy a reputation over a single misstep. This was the New York that would soon crown Mrs. Astor its queen, that would draw up its famous list of the 400 people who supposedly mattered, said to be the number that could fit inside her ballroom, and that would spend fortunes on balls and opera boxes purely to signal who stood where in the order of things. Into that world, a woman with a false name and a servant's origins was not supposed to be able to walk at all, let alone flourish. The wonder of Ida is that she did both, and that she did it not by luck, but by a patience so complete that from the outside it looks almost inhuman. The leap from mistress to wife was the most dangerous passage of her whole ascent, and she made it without a single false step. A mistress who pushed too hard was discarded. A mistress who grasped at marriage before the way was clear was cast out into scandal with nothing to her name. Ida did neither. She simply made herself necessary, so woven into the running of Benjamin's money and the order of his days that removing her would have cost him far more than keeping her ever could. She let the arrangement ripen until it looked, to everyone who saw it, like a marriage already in all but law, so that when the legal path at last swung open, stepping onto it changed nothing anyone could see except the name written on the papers. She had turned herself from a man's secret into a man's institution, and an institution is not thrown into the street. It is married. The rise was complete. She had wanted a place at the top of the world, and she had taken it with a letter and a will of iron, but the same thing that lifted her, the refusal to ever again be poor, the need to control every coin, was already turning underneath the glamour into something that would not switch off when the danger passed. She had built the wall high enough now to keep the poorhouse out. The trouble with a wall that high is that it also seals in the one who builds it, and she had begun, without knowing it, to lay the first courses of the room she would die in. Chapter 4. The Wife Who Counted His Winnings. Benjamin Wood could lose a fortune at a card table in a single night and walk home laughing, and that laughter frightened his wife more than anything in the world. To understand the marriage, and everything the marriage became, the gambling has to be understood first. Benjamin was not a man who played for pleasure now and then. He was a serious and habitual gambler, a fixture at the great gaming houses of the city. Above all, the celebrated establishment run by John Morrissey, the prizefighter turned gambling king. Money moved through Benjamin's hands like water through open fingers. He could win enormous sums, and he could lose them just as fast. And to a temperament like his, the swing itself was part of the thrill. For most wives, this would have been a private grief. For Ida, the girl who had counted every coin in a peddler's house, it was intolerable in a way that went all the way down to the bone. She had married money precisely so that she would never again stand close to poverty, and here was her own husband, night after night, carrying their security to a table and betting it against strangers. So she did what she had always done. She did not weep, and she did not beg. She made an arrangement. The terms of it, remembered long afterward, tell everything about the machine of her mind. She would take half of everything he won. Half of every winning night was hers, to be put away where his hands could not reach it. And his losses. The losses were entirely his own. She bore none of them. By this single rule, she turned his chaos into her accumulation. When he won, she quietly grew richer. When he lost, it cost her nothing. She had found a way to profit from the very habit that terrified her, and to bleed the danger out of it one settlement at a time. It is said she would even charge him for the hours she spent waiting outside his clubs, sitting in the carriage in the dark, adding his time to her account like a clerk. That is not the behavior of a greedy woman. Or not only that, it is the behavior of a frightened one. Every dollar she pulled out of Benjamin's reckless hands and locked away was another stone laid in the wall between herself and the crowded room she came from. She was not building a fortune to spend. She had never in her life been able to imagine safety as anything other than money already in her own hands, held tight and never let go of. It is worth pausing on how strange this arrangement was, and how much it gives away about her. A wife, in that era, was expected to know as little about money as possible, to be shielded from it as from something coarse, to take an allowance and ask no questions. Ida did the exact reverse. She made herself the treasurer of the marriage, the keeper of the books, the one who knew to the dollar what came in and what went out, and where every cent of it was kept. She was not shielded from the money. She was the wall the money lived behind, and she ran that wall with the vigilance of someone who had watched, as a child, exactly how fast a household with nothing could be tipped into ruin by a single bad week. The gambling world, Benjamin moved in, was a spectacle in its own right, and it fed her fear night after night. This was the age of the great New York gambling palaces, rooms of gaslight and green bays where fortunes changed hands between dusk and dawn, where a man could arrive a prince and leave a pauper and laugh about it on the walk home. John Morrissey, the former bare-knuckle champion who ran the most famous of these houses, had made himself rich and then powerful on exactly the recklessness that men like Benjamin carried to his tables. To Benjamin it was sport. To Ida, sitting in the carriage in the cold outside, listening to the muffled roar of men losing everything they had, it was the old enemy wearing evening dress, the same poverty that had haunted her childhood now dressed up and invited in to play cards with her husband. She did not go in, and she did not make scenes. She waited, and she counted, and she took her half, and she carried it home. Slowly the halves added up. Night after night, year after year, the winnings she skimmed and the losses she refused to share tilted the marriage's wealth steadily toward her, and she set all of it aside in places his hands could not reach. She was building capital the way a mason builds a wall, one course at a time, never spending, never easing, because to her the wall was never high enough to be finished. There is a coldness in it that is easy to judge and harder to understand, until one remembers where she began. Every dollar was not a comfort. It was a brick between herself and the crowded room, and no number of bricks could ever quite convince the girl who had lived in that room that it was really behind her for good. And so the same machinery that made her rich was quietly making her strange. The watchfulness that kept the fortune safe never rested, never trusted, never once allowed itself to believe the danger had finally passed. It is the mark of a certain kind of survivor, the one who claws out of poverty and can never afterward feel safe no matter how much is gathered, because the fear was laid down before the money and does not answer to it. Ida was becoming, in the very act of succeeding, a woman who could not stop. She had learned to turn a husband's recklessness into her own security, and she had learned it so completely that the lesson would outlast the husband and the security, and in the end, her own reason, and follow her all the way down into a sealed room. And she went further, into ground that was genuinely unusual for a woman of her time. Slowly, deliberately, across the years of the marriage, Ida arranged for the couple's wealth to be held not in Benjamin's name, but in her own. The houses, the holdings, the accounts, the assets, all of it drifted quietly under her control. In an age when a married woman was expected to own almost nothing, to be a legal shadow of her husband, Ida Wood made herself the true owner of everything they had. When Benjamin eventually died, a newspaper would note, almost in passing, that he had left very little personal property of his own. There was a plain reason for that. It was all hers. She had married a fortune, and then, coin by coin and deed by deed, she had taken it entirely into her own hands, and she did not intend to ever give it back to anyone, not to a bank, not to a relative, not to the world. Chapter 5. The family that was a fiction. The little girl she introduced to society as her daughter Emma was not her daughter at all. Ida did not only invent a father and a childhood, she invented a family to stand around her in the present, a cast of characters arranged to support the story of who she claimed to be. And the arrangement was so seamless that the truth of it was not untangled until investigators went digging through parish records decades after her death. There was a girl named Emma, born around the same year Ida arrived in New York, whom Ida raised and presented for the rest of her life as her own daughter. And there was a woman named Mary, whom Ida kept close and described as her sister. The comfortable public picture was a small, respectable household. A lady of Southern breeding, her daughter, her sister. The real picture, the one the records finally forced into view, was stranger and sadder. Emma and Mary were not what Ida said they were. The weight of the evidence gathered after her death pointed to both of them being her sisters. Two more of the Walsh children out of that same crowded Irish poverty, brought quietly into Ida's invented life and assigned new roles within it. Emma, who spent her whole life being called Ida's daughter, was in truth almost certainly Ida's sister, a younger girl passed off as a child to smooth over the awkward mathematics of Ida's fictional past. It is the kind of lie that shows how total the reinvention was. She did not merely hide her origins. She reassigned her own blood, turning a sister into a daughter, rewriting the people she loved to fit the story she had chosen to be true. Think of the discipline that took, sustained across a lifetime. Every introduction, every conversation, every casual question about family had to be met with the same fiction, held perfectly, for decades, in front of servants and friends and lawyers and the press. One slip, one careless word from Emma about their real mother, one document surfacing from Massachusetts, and the whole gracious edifice would come down, and the planter's daughter would be exposed as the peddler's. That constant low pressure, the fear that never fully left, is the private reality humming under all the glamour of these years. The dinners and the gowns and the congressman's wife receiving her guests, and underneath it, always, the girl watching the door, terrified that someone would recognize her. Consider what it actually meant to turn a sister into a daughter and hold that lie for a lifetime. Emma had a real mother and a real father, the same Walsh parents out of the same Irish poverty, and she was made to bury all of it and become a supporting player in Ida's invented drama, a daughter who had never been born to the woman she called mother. Mary, kept close and called a sister, at least kept her true relation. But she too had to guard the larger secret, to remember always which parts of the family story were permitted and which would bring the whole structure down. They lived inside Ida's fiction the way servants live inside a great house, knowing all its private truths and forbidden to speak a word of them beyond the door. The strain of maintaining such a thing is almost impossible to overstate. A single, ordinary conversation, the kind that fills every dinner and every drawing room, was a minefield. Where was she from? What had her mother been? What part of the South? How old had the child been when they came north? Every one of these harmless questions was a trapdoor, and Ida and her sisters had to step over all of them, flawlessly, in company, decade after decade, without ever once letting the mask slip. Most people cannot keep a small secret through a single evening. Ida kept an enormous one across an entire lifetime and taught the people she loved to keep it alongside her. It helps, too, to see how completely her society rewarded exactly this kind of deception and punished exactly the truth she was hiding. The Gilded Age was obsessed with lineage. Families paid genealogists to discover flattering ancestors, bought coats of arms, married their daughters to titled Europeans for the pedigree a title conferred. In a culture that hungry for bloodlines, an honest Irish origin was a wound, and a fine invented one was a passport, and Ida had simply supplied the market with what it demanded. The same society that would have shut every door against Ellen Walsh threw them wide for Ida Mayfield, and it never once occurred to any of them that the two might be the same woman, because the last thing that world wanted was to look too closely at where anybody's story truly began. And there is a grief buried inside all this calculation that is easy to miss. These were her own blood, the last real link to where she came from, and even they were not allowed to be what they were. She could not simply love a sister as a sister in the open. So even her family, the one warm human thing a person clings to, was conscripted into the performance and made a little false. Ida had built a fortress against poverty, and without quite meaning to, she had built a second fortress against ever being fully known by anyone, including the people closest to her in the world. That is the loneliness at the center of the glamour. And a woman who has spent 40 years unable to be honest, even with her own sisters, has already, long before any sealed room, been living behind a door. This is the gap that defines Ida Wood, and it is a gap worth pausing inside. On the surface, wealth, position, and a family tree with an earl in it. Underneath, an Irish girl who had turned her sisters into props and her father into a fiction, and who could never, for one single evening, simply relax into being herself, because she had spent her whole life making sure that self no longer existed. The fear did not come from the money. The fear came first, and the money was only ever the answer she reached for. She never stopped being afraid of the girl she used to be, and so she surrounded herself with a family that had been carefully instructed never to mention her. Chapter 6. The paper that was won at a card table. The New York Daily News, the fortune's public face, had by legend been won in a single hand of cards. The paper mattered because the paper was where the money and the name came together into something the city could see. Benjamin Wood owned the New York Daily News, a Democratic newspaper of the 1800s, and by the story that clung to him ever after, he had come to own it in the most Benjamin way imaginable by gambling for it and winning. Whether that tale is literally true, or simply the kind of legend that gathers around a famous gambler, it fit him perfectly, and Ida never discouraged it, because a paper won at cards made her husband sound like a man of dash and nerve rather than a reckless spender she had to manage. The Daily News gave Benjamin a public platform, a voice in the loud politics of the age, and it gave Ida something she valued more. It made them visible at the top. It turned the invented Southern belle into a fixture of New York, a woman whose position no longer had to be argued because everyone simply granted it. For a stretch of years, this was the glamour the fear had bought. Consider the scale of the world she now moved in. This was the New York of Mrs. Astor's famous 400, the number said to be the count of people who truly mattered, the size, so the story went, of the Astor ballroom. It was a city where a single society ball could cost tens of thousands of dollars, where a strand of pearls might run past 100,000, where the great houses of Fifth Avenue were rising in marble to announce fortunes that had not existed a generation before. New money was clawing its way up beside old, titles were being bought with railroad dollars, and into that churning, brilliant market of names and faces walked Ida Wood, holding a fortune, a newspaper, and a past she had made up out of whole cloth. And no one at the table knew she was bluffing with the strongest hand in the room. She was good at it. By every account, she was elegant, sharp, and formidable, a woman who gave nothing away. She had the money to dress the part, and the wit to hold a room, and she had the one advantage none of the real heiresses possessed. They had been handed their place and could lose it. She had built hers from nothing and knew exactly how much it was worth because she remembered precisely what the world looked like from the bottom. The newspaper deserves a closer look because it was the engine that turned money into visibility. In the 1800s, a daily paper was not the vast institution it would later become. It was a voice, often a partisan one, and to own it was to own a place in the loud running argument of the age. Benjamin Wood used the Daily News as a democratic instrument, a platform for his politics and his brothers, and through it, the Wood name reached breakfast tables across the city every morning. For a family and for a wife, that kind of visibility was worth more than any single sum of money because it made the Woods a permanent fixture rather than a passing fortune. People who might otherwise have wondered where Ida came from did not bother, because she was simply, obviously, one of the people who mattered, and the proof of it landed folded on the doorstep every day. That legend of the paper won at cards is worth turning over as well, true or not, because of what it meant to Ida that people believed it. A fortune won by hard, grinding work carries one kind of story. A fortune won in a single audacious hand of cards carries another. A story of nerve and luck and daring, and it flattered the whole enterprise of the Wood marriage. It let Benjamin be a gambler with a golden touch instead of a spendthrift, and it let Ida be the elegant wife of a bold man rather than the anxious minder of a reckless one. She never corrected the tale. She understood, as she understood most things about appearances, that the version of a story people repeat becomes, in time, the only version that survives. And the money itself, in these years, was staggering to anyone who stopped to add it up, though Ida rarely let anyone see her doing so. Here the scale of it deserves to be laid out plainly. A single grand ball in this New York could cost tens of thousands of dollars in one night. A necklace worn to it might run past $100,000. The marble houses climbing Fifth Avenue swallowed millions each, raised to announce fortunes that had not existed a single generation before. Against that backdrop, the Woods were not the very richest family in the city, but they sat comfortably inside the world of real wealth. And Ida, holding the purse and the deeds, sat at the center of their share of it, like a spider at the center of a web she had spun herself, feeling every thread. What none of the guests at those dinners could see was that she was never, for one moment, at ease inside the splendor. The other women in those rooms had been born to their place, or had married into it and settled comfortably in. Ida had built hers out of nothing and knew precisely how fragile a built thing can be. She watched the money the way a woman watches a fire in a dry season, and she watched the faces around her table for any flicker of a question about who she really was. She had everything the age called success, and she held all of it, always, at arm's length, braced for the day it might be taken back. And yet even here, at the height of it, the shadow was moving under the shine. Benjamin was aging, and his habits were not improving. The gambling went on. The money still had to be watched every single day, because the man beside her would never stop reaching for the table. The set piece of the Gilded Age marriage, the elegant wife and the sporting husband, and the newspaper and the fine rooms, was real enough for anyone looking in from the street. But the woman inside it was not resting. She was standing guard. She had reached the top of the world and discovered the thing no one is ever warned about, that the top does not feel like safety to a woman who has clawed her own way up to it. It feels like a ledge, and she was already, quietly, looking for a way to climb down off the ledge and into somewhere with no windows at all. Chapter 7. The night the money came home in a bag. When Benjamin died in 1900, the one man who could spend the fortune was gone, and only the keeping was left. His death took away the single force in Ida's life that had ever pulled money outward, into the world, onto the table, into pleasure and risk and motion. For all the terror his gambling caused her, Benjamin had also been the reason the money moved at all, the reason there were winnings to halve and nights out and a public life to dress for. With him gone, the marriage's one spender was silenced, and Ida was left alone with the two things she had spent her whole life gathering: a great fortune, and the fear that had driven her to gather it. There was no longer anyone to spend against. There was only the wall, and the tending of the wall. She moved quickly to turn the last of the position into cash she could hold. In 1901, the year after Benjamin's death, she sold the New York Daily News to the publisher, Frank Munsey. The price, by the figures that survive, ran somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000, a sum worth many millions in today's money. It was the final conversion. The newspaper, the public platform, the visible proof of standing, all of it dissolved into money, and money was the only thing Ida had ever fully trusted. She was letting go of the glamour on purpose, trading the thing that made her seen for the thing that made her safe. Then came the blow that broke something in her for good. In 1907, a great financial panic swept through the American banking system. Banks failed. Depositors who had believed their savings were secure watched institutions close their doors. For most people, the panic of 1907 was a frightening season that passed. For a woman whose entire soul was built around the conviction that money in a bank could vanish overnight and leave her standing in the crowded room again. It was the confirmation of her deepest fear arriving in the newspapers as fact. If the banks could fall, then no fortune held inside them was ever truly hers. There was only one form of wealth she could believe in now: cash. Cash in her own hands, under her own eye, behind her own door. And so she did the thing that turned her from a wealthy widow into a legend. She went to the Guarantee Trust Company and she took her fortune out. Not a portion of it, very nearly the whole of it, an amount approaching $1 million, carried out of the bank by the account that has come down through the years, in a great netted bag. Picture it plainly, because it is one of the strangest images in the history of American wealth. A small, elegant widow walking out of a bank with close to $1 million in currency in a bag, choosing to carry her entire fortune on her body rather than trust it to any vault but her own person. The netted bag is where the money first becomes a thing she wears, and it will stay on her, in one form or another, until the day she dies. There is a temptation to call what she did madness, but it was something more unsettling than madness. It was perfect consistency. Every step of it followed directly from the single belief she had held since she was a hungry child, that safety is money physically held in the hand and never let go of. Give that belief a bank panic to confirm it, and a dead husband to remove the only counterweight, and the sealed room is not a break with her character at all. It is her character, arriving at last at its logical destination. The frightening thing about Ida Wood is not that she lost her reason. It is how reasonable each single step looks to anyone who begins where she began. And consider for a moment the sheer physical strangeness of the thing she carried out. A fortune of close to $1 million is not a light or a small object when it takes the form of paper currency. It is bricks of banknotes, bundle upon bundle of them, a weight and a bulk that must be counted and packed and moved and hidden. She had chosen the hardest possible way to hold wealth, the way that demanded constant vigilance and could never be set down. And she chose it precisely because the difficulty was the point. Money in a vault could be reached by others. Money in her own rooms, under her own eye, could be reached only through her. She was not merely keeping her fortune. She was becoming the vault, the single living lock that stood between the world and everything she owned. The place she chose for it tells its own quiet story. Not a mansion, not a fine townhouse with servants and a garden, but a plain two-room suite in the Herald Square Hotel, an ordinary commercial hotel in the middle of the city. A woman worth a fortune deliberately picked modest, anonymous rooms, the kind of place a person disappears into rather than displays herself from. She did not want to be seen. She wanted to be unremarkable, a small old widow of no particular interest in a busy hotel, while behind her door sat a treasure. The choice of somewhere so plain was not thrift alone. It was camouflage, the same instinct that would one day hide a diamond necklace inside a box of stale crackers, turned now upon the task of hiding herself. With that bag, and with her sister Mary and the woman she called her daughter Emma, Ida withdrew from the world. She took rooms at the Herald Square Hotel, a modest two-room suite on the 5th floor, and she closed the door. She was about 69 years old. She had reached the top of the world, and now, of her own free will, with a fortune most people could not imagine, she was climbing down into 2 dark rooms to guard it. The wall was finished. The door swung shut, and behind it, the longest and strangest chapter of her life began, 24 years in which almost no living person would see her face. Chapter 8. The door that stayed shut for 24 years. For 24 years, almost no living person saw the inside of those 2 rooms. The suite at the Herald Square Hotel was small And it grew smaller, in a sense, with every passing year, because Ida filled it. She did not live in those rooms the way a wealthy woman lives. She occupied them the way a miser occupies a hoard, or the way a frightened animal occupies a burrow. The curtains stayed drawn. The air went stale and then staler, thick with dust and the smell of the cheap cigars she smoked, and the petroleum jelly she used, and the food she kept. Cleaning was not permitted. Maids were turned away at the door, year after year, and on the rare occasions Ida accepted anything from the hotel staff, fresh linens, a delivery, it was handed through a door opened only a crack by a hand that did not want to be seen. One manager of the hotel would later say that in 7 years of running the place, he had never once laid eyes on the woman in the suite on the 5th floor. What did she live on? This widow with close to $1 million in the room. She lived on almost nothing. Her diet, remembered by the bellboys who carried it up, was the diet of the truly poor, not the rich. Crackers, evaporated milk, coffee, bacon and eggs. Now and then a piece of fish, sometimes raw. Copenhagen snuff and cheap cigars. It was the menu of a woman counting pennies, and she counted them ferociously. When food was brought up, she interrogated the cost of it, and anything she judged too dear went straight back down. How much did this cost? She would demand, and if the answer displeased her, the reply was flat and final. It is too much. Take it back. I will not eat it. She tipped the boys who ran her errands in dimes, 10 cents at a time, a small dark coin pressed into a young hand by a woman with hundreds of thousands of dollars stitched into the room around her. Here is the heart of the thing, the gap that makes people who hear this story stop and shake their heads. She was not poor. She was almost unimaginably rich, and she was starving herself in the dark, refusing a meal that cost more than $1, tipping in dimes, precisely because the fear had won completely. The wall of money she had spent her whole life building had done the one thing walls do when they are built too high and too close. It had stopped being protection and become a prison, and she was the prisoner. And she had locked the door herself and thrown away nothing, because throwing anything away was the one act her whole nature could not perform. Try to imagine the texture of a single ordinary day in that suite, because the horror of it lies in the ordinariness repeated across nearly 9,000 days. The curtains stay drawn against the morning. The air does not move. Ida rises in the gloom among her trunks and her boxes, a tiny figure in clothing worn long past shabby, and she takes a little coffee, a few crackers, some evaporated milk. She smokes a cheap cigar. She checks things, or counts things, or simply sits with the money that is always near her. No visitors come, because none are admitted. No news of the world reaches her that she has not refused. The day passes in dim silence, and then another exactly like it, and then 1,000 more, and the woman at the center of them grows a little smaller and a little stranger with each one. The refusals were absolute, and they were the whole architecture of her days. Maids were turned from the door, doctors were not called, repairs were not permitted. The staff of the hotel learned to leave her alone, to slide a delivery through a barely opened door and retreat, to expect nothing and see nothing. Think of what it means that a manager could run the hotel for 7 years and never once set eyes on the woman in the 5th floor suite. She had made herself into a rumor within her own building, a presence felt but never seen, a locked door at the end of a hall that the bellboys spoke of the way children speak of a haunted room, and the meanness with money, in the very middle of all that money, never once relaxed. The dime tips, the meals sent back for costing more than $1, the endless interrogation of every small price. How much did this cost? It is too much. Take it back. I will not eat it. To the boys who carried her trays, she must have seemed the poorest guest in the hotel, a pinched old woman haggling over pennies. And not one of them could have dreamed that the pennies she guarded so fiercely sat atop hundreds of thousands of dollars stitched into the room behind her. What was growing in those rooms, alongside the dust, was the hoard itself. Ida did not throw things away. She could not. To discard anything was to lose it, and losing anything, even a scrap, ran against the deepest grain of her nature. Somewhere in her mind, the difference between keeping herself safe and keeping every object she had ever touched had dissolved entirely, until the guarding of the fortune and the guarding of the crackers and the guarding of the unworn gowns had become one single unbroken act, performed in the dark, without pause, year after year, by a woman who had forgotten there was any other way to live. The trunks began to arrive, or rather to accumulate, because much of what filled them had been gathered across a lifetime and was now simply sealed up and stacked. The rooms could not hold everything, and so her possessions spread outward into the hotel basement, into a warehouse, a growing archive of a life lived and then refused. And still the door stayed shut, and the years went by outside it, the automobiles replacing the carriages on the street below, the city roaring on into a new century, while behind the drawn curtains on the 5th floor, 3 aging women sat guarding a fortune in the dark, and time did to them what time does to anything sealed away and forgotten. Chapter 9. The trunks no one was allowed to open, stacked against the walls, hidden in the basement, packed away in a warehouse, were 54 trunks that Ida guarded like a dragon over gold. When at last those trunks were opened, after her death, they told the whole story of her nature in a single devastating inventory, because of what was in them, and of the fact that none of it had ever been used. Here was a woman who had denied herself a decent meal for a quarter of a century, and here, in the 54 trunks she had dragged through the years, was a hoard of pure luxury, bought and then locked away and never worn. There were gowns from Paris, beautiful dresses that had never been taken out of their wrappings. There was lace, exquisite lace, from Ireland and from Venice and from Spain, the finest handwork in the world. There were necklaces and bracelets and watches and tiaras. There were relics she had gathered like a magpie of history, gold certificates from the 1860s, a letter written by Charles Dickens to Benjamin Wood, a gold-headed walking stick she claimed had once belonged to a president of the United States. Now hold the 2 images side by side, because holding them together is the only way to feel the truth of her. In one hand, the crackers and the evaporated milk and the dime tips and the food sent back for costing too much. In the other, this. Consider the arithmetic of that hoard. 54 trunks of unworn splendor. A diamond necklace later valued at around $40,000, a sum that could have bought a fine house outright, found not in a jewel case but tucked inside a box of stale crackers, treasure hidden inside garbage. Bills in denominations of $1,000 and $5,000 and even $10,000, the largest notes the country made, folded into shoeboxes and oilcloth and the linings of her clothing. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in a railroad company's stock, sitting untouched, its dividends left uncollected for a dozen years, because collecting them would have meant contact with the world, and contact with the world was the one thing she would not risk. She had money working for her that she could not bring herself to walk downstairs and claim. The necklace in the cracker box is the truest single object in her whole life, and it deserves to be held up and looked at. A thing of enormous value, deliberately hidden inside a thing of no value, so that no one would think to look, so that no thief and no relative and no bank and no government would ever find it. That was her mind entire. Disguise the precious as the worthless. Let the world see crackers and never suspect diamonds. She had done the same thing to herself, after all, decades before. She had taken the precious truth of who she was, the Irish girl, the peddler's daughter, and she had hidden it inside an invented worthlessness so complete that the world saw only the wrapper. Ida Mayfield was the box of crackers. Ellen Walsh was the necklace inside. Walk through that inventory slowly, because each object is a small confession. The gowns from Paris, still in their wrappings, speak of a woman who bought the idea of a glittering life and then could not permit herself to live it. The lace from Ireland is almost unbearable in its irony, the finest handwork of the very country she had spent her life denying she came from, gathered and treasured and hidden in the dark by a woman who would not admit she was Irish. The gold certificates from the 1860s are the savings of the marriage years, kept in their original paper across half a century, currency that had quietly gone out of date while she held it, because holding was the only thing she knew how to do with money. The uncollected dividends may be the single most revealing detail of all. She owned a great block of railroad stock, something on the order of $175,000 in value, and that stock paid dividends, money owed to her, money she had earned simply by owning it, and she did not collect it. For a dozen years the payments piled up unclaimed, because collecting them would have meant correspondence, a transaction, contact with the outside world, and contact was the one thing her fear would not allow. Sit with the strangeness of that. Here was a woman so devoted to money that she starved herself in the dark to keep it, and she left a small fortune in earned dividends lying untouched because reaching for it meant opening the door. Her love of money had curdled past greed into something that actively cost her money. That is the final turn of the hoarder's logic, the place where it begins to eat itself. The point of the fortune had always been safety, but somewhere in the sealed years, the keeping of it stopped serving the safety and began to devour it. She would not spend the money to feed herself properly. She would not spend it to be warm or clean or cared for. She would not even gather the money that her money was making. The hoard had become an end in itself, a thing to be guarded not for what it could buy, but simply because it was hers, and letting go of any part of it, for any reason at all, had become unthinkable. She was no longer a rich woman using her wealth. She was a poor woman standing guard over a pile she was forbidden by her own terror to touch. And the gowns, the poor unworn gowns, say the last thing there is to say about the cost of it all. She had bought beauty and never let herself have it. She had bought the dresses of a woman who goes to balls, and then she had climbed into a dark room and eaten crackers alone for 24 years while the dresses waited in their wrappings in the dark beside her. The fortune had not made her rich. It had made her its keeper, and a keeper owns nothing. She guarded a hoard of glory and lived like the poorest woman in New York, and she could not see, or could not bear to see, that the wall she had built against poverty had simply become poverty by another name. A Chapter 10. The Sisters Who Grew Old in the Dark. 3 women went into those rooms, and time worked on them the way it works on anything sealed away from the light. It is easy, telling this story, to see only Ida, the strange, rich miser, alone with her fortune. But she was not alone in there, not for most of it, and the others in the dark are part of the human cost that the glamour of the earlier years so completely hid. Her sister Mary was with her, the woman she called her sister truthfully for once, and Emma, the sister she had spent a lifetime calling her daughter. 3 aging women, bound together by blood and by a shared secret, shut inside 2 rooms with the curtains drawn, growing older and stranger and more frail as the decades turned over outside the window. Think of what those years were actually like for the 3 of them. shut in together with the curtains drawn. Whatever passed between these women in the dark happened out of all sight and all record, a private world sealed off from the century going by outside. They had been born into the same Irish poverty and had risen and fallen together, and now, at the end, they had only one another and the fortune they were guarding. No friends were admitted, no callers, no outings, no letters welcomed. Time in that suite did not move the way it moved in the world below. It pooled and thickened and went stale like the air. The roaring decade of the 1920s was blaring and dancing through the streets just beneath their windows, a whole loud new America being born. And behind the drawn curtains on the 5th floor, 3 old women sat in the gloom as though the calendar had stopped, keepers of a past that no longer existed anywhere but in their sealed rooms and Ida's stubborn memory. Emma went first. She died in 1928, an old woman herself by then, past 70, having spent her entire life inside another woman's fiction, known to the world as the daughter of a mother who was really her sister. Whatever Emma had wanted from her own life, she had lived it as a supporting character in Ida's, and she died as one, quietly, her true place in the family still hidden. With her death, the sealed household shrank from 3 to 2, and the 2 who remained, Ida and Mary, drew further down into the dark. By now, Ida was very old and very small. The years of near starvation and no air and no sun had reduced her to almost nothing. She stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed near the end something like 70 pounds, a tiny bent figure, nearly deaf, moving through the cluttered gloom of the suite among the trunks and the shoeboxes and the stacks of the past. And still, on her body, day and night, she carried the money. The habit that had begun with the netted bag from the bank had never stopped. She kept great sums close against her skin, banknotes in an oilcloth pocket sewn or pinned inside her clothing, so that even in sleep, even in the deepest dark of the sealed room, her fortune was on her person, worn like a second skin she could not take off. The money had been ambition once, in the letter. It had been armor, in the withdrawal. Now it was simply part of her, grown into her the way a shell grows into the thing that carries it. Spare a thought, before leaving these years, for Mary. Of the 3 women in the dark, she is the one most easily forgotten, and her life may be the saddest of all. She had followed Ida through every stage of the long invention, out of the Irish poverty and into the borrowed grandeur, and finally down into the sealed rooms, and she had given her whole existence to her sister's story without ever once being its heroine. She kept the secret. She played her assigned part. She grew old inside another woman's fear, in another woman's rooms, guarding another woman's fortune. And when the end came, it would be Mary's dying that finally broke the spell. Whatever Mary might have wanted from her own years on the earth, she spent them as a supporting figure in Ida's, loyal to the last. And it is worth remembering that the wall Ida built did not only wall herself away. It sealed in the 2 people who loved her most, and it kept them there, in the dark, until it killed one of them and exposed the other. What was it for? That is the question that hangs over the whole sealed decade, and there is no comfortable answer. It was not for spending, because she spent nothing. It was not for enjoying, because she enjoyed nothing. It was not even, in the end, for security in any way that a sane accounting would recognize, because a woman starving in the dark on a fortune is not secure. She is destroyed. The money was for holding. That was all. She had built her entire self around the act of holding money and never letting go, and when everything else fell away, the position and the husband and the newspaper and the balls and even the daylight, the holding was the last thing left. and she held it to the end, in the dark, with her sister dying beside her, because she no longer knew how to be a person who did anything else. Chapter 11. The Cry That Ended the Silence. On a March morning in 1931, for the first time in 24 years, Ida Wood opened her door and called out for help. What broke the silence at last was not the money and not the law. It was love, or the nearest thing to it that survived in that room. Mary was dying, and Ida, who had let no maid and no doctor and no living soul past her door for a quarter of a century, who had guarded that threshold as the last line of the wall, could not simply sit in the dark and let her sister die untended. So she did the one thing she had sworn never to do. She opened the door and she cried out into the corridor. "Maid, come here. My sister is sick. Get a doctor." After 24 years, the sound of that voice in the hallway must have been like a sound from behind a tomb. The recluse of the 5th floor, the woman no one had seen, was suddenly real. An old woman in a doorway begging for help for someone she loved. Slow the moment down, because this is the hinge of the whole story. The instant, after 24 years, when the sealed world finally cracked. What broke it was not the law, and not a thief, and not the failing of her own body. It was Mary. Her sister was dying, there in the dark beside her, and Ida faced the one thing her fear had never prepared her for, a choice between the door and the person she loved. For a quarter of a century, the door had been sacred, the last line of the wall, never to be opened for any reason at all. And she opened it. She chose Mary over the fortress, and in doing so she ended the secret she had guarded her whole life, because a door once opened cannot be fully closed again. Whatever the hotel staff expected when they finally came through it, it cannot have been what they found. For more than 2 decades, that door had been a blank refusal, a thing the building simply worked around, and now it stood open on a scene out of a nightmare. 2 rooms, thick with the dust and close air of a quarter century. Trunks and boxes crammed into every corner. One old woman dying on a couch, and another, tiny and deaf and fierce, moving among the clutter, living in a squalor that looked like the deepest poverty a great city could produce. The recluse of the 5th floor was real at last, and to every eye that first fell on her, she appeared to be a pauper, the poorest woman in the hotel, ending her days in the filth with nothing. It was the most complete disguise in her whole life of disguises, and it was about to fail in the most spectacular way imaginable. It was too late for Mary, who died soon after, and it was the beginning of the end of the secret, because once the door was open, it could not be fully closed again. The hotel, the doctors, and then the courts came into Ida's sealed world, and what they found there began to leak out into the newspapers and then to astonish the entire country. For here, in squalor, in 2 filthy rooms, was a fortune. The reversal, when it came, was total, and it is the heart of why this story has never let go of anyone who hears it. The deeper the outsiders looked, the less the squalor held together. There was money here. Not a little hidden savings of the kind a frightened old woman keeps by her, but money everywhere, tucked and pinned and boxed throughout the grime. More of it the further they searched, until the meaning of the whole suite turned itself inside out. This was not the room of a pauper. It was the strongest room in the hotel, the private treasury of a woman who had spent 24 years posing as its poorest guest. The inventory, as it came to light, reads like something invented, and every piece of it was real. In a shoebox, in a suite that looked like the room of the destitute, they found $247,200 in cash, in bills of $1,000 and $5,000. On her person, in that oilcloth pocket held against her skin, was another $500,000 in $10,000 notes, the largest the nation printed. There was around $175,000 in railroad stock whose dividends she had not touched in a dozen years. There was the diamond necklace in the cracker box. There were the 54 trunks. A woman who had eaten like a pauper had been sleeping every night with more money on her body than most Americans would see in 100 lifetimes. The newspapers seized on all of it, and no wonder. Here was a story with everything in it: wealth and squalor and mystery, and a locked room held shut for a generation. The recluse of Herald Square, the miser widow starving on a mountain of cash. The public devoured the tale and has never entirely let it go since. But underneath the sensation, past the astonishing sums, lay the older and sadder truth that most of the reporters hurried straight past. This was not merely a curiosity. It was the endpoint of a fear that had begun in a crowded Irish room 70 years before, made visible at last in banknotes and dust. The wall Ida had spent her life raising had finally been seen from the outside, and the woman who built it was still inside it, fighting with the last of her strength to keep anyone from taking a single brick. The law moved to protect her from herself. In the autumn of 1931, she was declared incompetent to manage her own affairs. This woman, who had outmanaged a gambler husband and a great fortune for half a century, and the cost of her sudden care ran to more than $3,000 a month. She fought all of it. She did not want protection. She did not want to be moved. "Why?" she demanded when they tried to take her from her rooms. "I can take care of myself." When at last they moved her to a different room, she wept, and at least once, frightened and cornered by the very people trying to help her, the old terror broke all the way through, and the tiny deaf woman who had ruled her own sealed kingdom for 24 years cried out the truest thing she had said in years: "Help! Help! I am a prisoner. Get me out of here." She was right, of course. She was a prisoner. She had only ever been confused about who the jailer was. Chapter 12. The fortune that outlived the fear. They had found her money at last, but they could not make her spend a single dollar of it. In the final stretch of her life, stripped of the secrecy that had protected her and surrounded by strangers counting her fortune, Ida did not soften, and she did not confess. She held her line with the same iron she had shown at 19, writing to a married man. When they called her incompetent, she was bewildered and offended by the word, and her answer to it is one of the most revealing things she ever said. "I did quite well," she protested, "and it seems strange they should call me incompetent. I made money, and I kept it." Hear the whole of her worldview in that one sentence. To Ida, competence was not living well, or being happy, or being loved, or being safe in any way a body could feel. Competence was making money and keeping it, and by that measure, the only measure she had ever trusted, she had been the most competent woman alive. She had made a fortune out of nothing, and she had kept every dollar. That it had cost her the daylight, the world, her own name, and the last decades of her life did not enter the ledger, because those things had never been on the ledger at all. And to the very end, she clung to the fiction, the invented self she had worn for 75 years. Even now, old and exposed and dying, she insisted on who she had decided to be. "I am a Mayfield," she told them. "I grew up in the city of New Orleans. There was no New Orleans. There had never been a New Orleans. There was a peddler's cart in Massachusetts, and a crowded room and a Dublin slum grandmother, and the woman saying these words knew it better than anyone on earth. And she said the words anyway, because to stop saying them, even at the end, even to no advantage, would have been to let Ellen Walsh back into the room, and that she would not do while she still drew breath. There is a bitter comedy in the spectacle of the courts and the doctors descending on Ida Wood to declare her incapable of handling money. This was a woman who had handled money with more skill and more iron than almost anyone of her age, man or woman. She had outmanaged a gambler husband for decades. She had moved an entire fortune into her own name in an era that barely let women own their shoes. She had read the Panic of 1907 correctly enough to pull her wealth out whole, while others lost everything they had. By the cold measure of getting money and keeping money, she had been something close to a genius, and now a room full of officials was gravely informing her that she could not be trusted to manage her own affairs. No wonder the word offended her to the core. By her own lights, the only lights she had ever trusted, the judgment was simply absurd. And so she defended herself with the one argument that made perfect sense inside her worldview and almost none outside it. "I did quite well," she said, "and it seems strange they should call me incompetent. I made money and I kept it." To her, that sentence was a complete and unanswerable defense, because to her, making money and keeping it was the whole of what a life was for. She could not see, or would not, that a person can make and keep a great fortune and still fail utterly at the one task that truly matters, which is to live. She had kept everything except a life, and she did not count its absence as a loss, because it had never once appeared anywhere in her accounts. The indignities of that final year fell on her one after another, and she resisted every one of them. She did not want to be examined. She did not want to be moved. When they shifted her out of the rooms she had sealed herself into for a generation, she wept like a child taken from home, because those 2 dark rooms, prison though they were the only place on earth she felt safe. And still, through all of it, she held the line on who she was. Not Ellen Walsh. Never Ellen Walsh. To the officials, to the doctors, to anyone who asked, she was Ida Mayfield of New Orleans, daughter of a planter, and she would go on being Ida Mayfield until the very moment there was no breath left to say it with. She died on the 12th of March, 1932, of bronchial pneumonia in the hotel that had been her fortress and her cell. She was 94 years old. She had outlived her husband by more than 30 years, outlived her sisters, outlived the century she was born into, and most of the people who had ever known her by any name. She died as she had insisted on living, as Ida Mayfield Wood, belle of a South she had never seen, and the fortune she had guarded so ferociously for so long lay all around her, in the trunks and the shoeboxes and the oilcloth against her cooling skin, having done for her, in the end, absolutely nothing. It had brought her no comfort, no joy, no company, and no peace. It had only outlived the fear that made her hoard it, sitting there in the dark, waiting for the strangers who were already, even now, beginning to gather. Chapter 13. 1,100 strangers at the door. In life, almost no one had been allowed near her, and in death more than 1,000 people swore they were her family. The irony of it would have been unbearable to her, and it is hard to imagine a fate she would have hated more. Ida Wood had spent her entire life making sure no one could ever know who she really was, or lay a hand on what was hers. And the instant she died, the fortune she had hidden so well and the identity she had buried so deep became the great public treasure hunt of the age. There was a fortune of roughly $1 million and no clear heir, because the woman who had died had spent 75 years erasing the very family that might have claimed her. So the claimants came, and they came in a flood. As many as 1,103 people, by the count that has come down through the years, stepped forward to swear that they were the blood of Ida Mayfield Wood, an army of Mayfields and Woods and strangers of every description, each with a story, each reaching for a share of the dead woman's hoard. Untangling the truth fell to the lawyers, and above all, to two men, Edward Corcoran, an attorney who first began to pull at the threads, and Joseph Cox, counsel to the public administrator, who would follow the mystery all the way down and later write the definitive account of it. What they had to do was the one thing Ida had devoted her life to preventing. They had to find out who she actually was. And so, working backward through baptismal records and marriage records, through parish registers and family papers found in the suite, including, remarkably, a handwritten family tree Ida herself had kept, they chased the invented Mayfield of New Orleans back through the fiction, back through New York, back to Massachusetts, and back at last across the ocean toward Ireland, until the planter's daughter dissolved entirely, and there stood, plainly, at the bottom of it all, Ellen Walsh, child of Thomas Walsh, the Irish peddler. There was one detail in the search almost too strange to believe. A final irony folded into a life already full of them. Among the papers found in the squalor of the suite was a family record in Ida's own hand, a pedigree she had kept, listing the very people she had spent a lifetime denying. The woman who had erased Ellen Walsh from the world had, in the privacy of her sealed rooms, quietly written down the truth of her own family and held on to it, the way she held on to everything, unable to destroy even the one document that could undo her whole invention. She could not let go of the money, and it turned out she could not fully let go of the truth either. She had hidden it, exactly as she hid the necklace in the crackers, inside a life built entirely to conceal it. And in the end, there it was, waiting to be found. What the investigators slowly assembled, out of parish registers and baptismal records and that handwritten sheet, was the ordinary family Ida had thrown away. There had been a large brood of Walsh children, born to Thomas Walsh, the peddler, and his Dublin wife, scattered by poverty and time across America and back toward the old country. Some had stayed poor, some had drifted out of all record, and a handful of their descendants were still living in Ireland and England and the United States. Ordinary people with no idea that a fortune in a New York hotel had anything to do with them, because the woman who held it had spent her whole life making certain they never would. There is a hard lesson in who finally received the money, and it lands with the weight of the whole story behind it. Ida had guarded her fortune against every living soul, had let it warm her body in the dark rather than trust it to a bank or share it with a friend. And it went, in the end, to strangers by blood, to distant relations of the very Irish family she had denied, most of whom had never met her, and none of whom had ever been allowed close. The wall had kept out everyone she knew and let in only people she did not. She had spent 75 years and a fortune making certain that Ellen Walsh did not exist, and the last act of her estate was a court of law declaring, formally and forever, that Ellen Walsh was the only person who ever truly had. The court gave its judgment in 1937. The great mass of claimants, the 1,100 hopeful strangers, were swept away, because almost none of them could connect themselves to the real woman, the Irish woman, since almost none of them had ever known she existed. What the identification proved was that Ida Mayfield had never been born, and that the fortune belonged to the true family of Ellen Walsh. In the end, of the whole vast crowd, only about 10 genuine relatives were recognized, real descendants of the Walsh line scattered across Ireland, England, and the United States, and the fortune was divided among them, something on the order of $87,000 each. Strangers by blood, most of whom had likely never met her, and had certainly never been allowed near her, inherited the money she had starved in the dark to keep. She had guarded it from everyone, and it went to people she did not know, under the name she had spent her whole life trying to destroy. Chapter 14. The Name on the Stone. Everything Ida Wood ever built was meant to keep a single secret, and death told that secret in an afternoon. Stand back now and look at the shape of the whole life, because the shape is the meaning. A poor Irish girl, ashamed and frightened, decided that the truth of her was intolerable and that she would replace it with something finer. She was extraordinary at it. With a single letter and a will like a blade, she wrote herself out of the crowded room and into a congressman's fortune. And she held that fortune against a reckless husband and a suspicious society and 2 great banking panics. And she did it all while a woman of her era was expected to own nothing and be no one. By any measure of nerve and cunning, Ida Wood won. She got, exactly as the fortune-teller had promised the frightened girl long ago, a rich husband and everything she wanted out of this life. And that is the horror folded inside the triumph, the thing the promise did not mention. She got everything she wanted, and it turned out that what she wanted was a wall, and a wall, built high enough, is only ever a cell with the door on the inside. The fortune she gathered to keep the poorhouse out became the 2 dark rooms she died starving in. The name she invented to escape her origins became the mask she could not take off even to save her own life. The sisters she loved, she rewrote into props, and the daughter she never had, she mourned in the person of a sister she had spent a lifetime denying. Every stone she laid against the fear ended up sealing her in with it. She never stopped being afraid of the girl she used to be, and in the end, the fear was the only thing she never managed to hoard away, because it was the one thing she carried on the inside, closer even than the money against her skin. Picture, if you can, what it would take to live like that. To hold in your own 2 hands a fortune that could buy anything the world offers, and to be unable, for one single day in 24 years, to open your hand. To sit in the dark, with diamonds hidden in the crackers, and never once feel rich. That is not greed, whatever the newspapers said. It is fear so old and so deep that no amount of money could ever fill the hole it came from, because the hole was dug in childhood, in a crowded room, in the shame of a name, long before there was any money at all. She spent a fortune and a lifetime trying to become someone safe, and she died as the most frightened woman in New York. Return, at the end, to the promise the frightened girl carried out of childhood, the fortune-teller's words she loved to repeat all her life. You are going to be a very lucky girl. You are going to marry a rich man and get everything you want out of this life. Every word of it came true, exactly as spoken. She married a rich man. She got everything she wanted. And getting everything she wanted was the ruin of her, because what she wanted was never happiness, or love, or a safety the body could feel. What she wanted was to hold the money and never let go, and the prophecy granted it in full, and the granting of it was a life sentence served out in 2 dark rooms. So the ledger of Ida Wood balances to a strange and terrible 0. On one side, a triumph almost without equal, a penniless immigrant girl who willed herself into a fortune and a name and a place at the top of the most closed society in America, and held all 3 against every force that might have taken them. On the other side, a woman who died tiny and deaf and terrified in the dark, starving on that same fortune, mourned by no one who knew her real name, her sisters gone, her whole life a performance with no audience left to see it. The rise and the ruin were not 2 separate stories. They were the same story. The same iron will pointed at the same fixed star, and the star was money. And money, it turns out, makes a poor thing to steer a life by. Near the very end, stripped of her secrecy and her rooms, Ida gave the world her own epitaph, truer than anything a stranger could ever carve for her. "I made money," she said, "and I kept it." She meant it as a defense against the charge that she was incompetent. It works far better as the verdict on the whole of her life. She had made money, and she had kept it. And she had kept it so well and so long and so completely that it had cost her every other thing a life is made of. 4 plain words, and the whole of her folded up inside them. They buried her, and in time, the truth went onto the record that she had fought so long to keep off it. The Southern belle was a peddler's daughter. Ida Mayfield was Ellen Walsh. The door that had stayed shut for 24 years had been forced open by a dying sister's need. And behind it, the world found not a monster and not a queen, but a small, frightened old woman who had mistaken a prison for a fortress right up until the end, and who had guarded, with everything she had, the one possession that was never worth the price. Behind the velvet and the glamour, there was only ever the girl watching the carriages roll past, certain that the cold would come back for her, building her wall a little higher every year, until at last it closed over her head, and the only name they could carve for certain on the stone was the one she had spent her whole life running from. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because every week I go looking for another life like Ida's, the private ruin hidden underneath the public glamour of the Gilded Age. And before you go, I want to hear from you. If you had built a fortune out of fear the way Ida did, do you honestly believe you could ever have spent a single dollar of it, or would you have guarded it to the very end? Tell me in the comments. I read them all.